My first fork was the Truss fork. Truss fork like this, stiff front to rear, and in titanium with a little bit of flex up and down, but not much. It's a pretty stiff fork. I designed this fork to be the lightest fork I could make with the best performance out of titanium. If I made a two-legged fork, it would kind of flex back and forth or not be strong enough. So by building this truss design, it came out to be a very strong, very light design. After a while of only making truss forks, I decided to have some Unicrown forks. I eventually developed these, and this is the original version. It has no bosses on it for racks or anything. It's not for a through axle. It's quick release type dropout, but still great fork. And I'll show you some bikes it's been on. This is a bike that is very similar to one that I sent out to a few different magazines because I realized that my Jones 29 bike that I had out for several years was very good for touring, city, road, or whatever. Actually better than a touring bike because usually touring bikes would have skinnier tires and drop bars. So here's a bike with the older version, very beefy fork, large butted tubes, thicker down at the bottom, thinner in the center, and had bosses here for racks. The red bike I just showed you is the exact same bike as this. The frame and fork are basically the same. This one's just set up as a single speed with knobby tires, but the red bike had the same rims, frame set, everything. It's just was set up more for touring in city. So this one bike that's good for touring city gravel road, this is one of my older ones. So again, one of the older forks here with the quick release dropouts. One of the things about my forks, the Unicrown fork and the Truss fork, was originally I was using quick release 135 hub spacing for a front hub. And this way you would have the widest flange spacing so that the wheel would be stronger and stiffer. This is the latest version of the titanium truss fork. Very similar to the original design, same little kind of triangle brace pattern here, same curved leg in the rear and the front with the big kind of three-dimensional hooded dropouts. Again, the 150 is a standard. This allows you to use other hubs besides my own. Previously, I made my own hubs because everyone was using 100 millimeter front hubs, which was just not building a stiff enough front wheel or front end for my liking. So now we have these. So since I've showed you the new titanium truss fork, now I think I'm ready to show you the new Unicrown fork. So here's the new, two of them, Jones Unicrown forks. There's one that's called the short wheelbase version, and this is for Jones 29-inch wheel bikes or the new Jones short wheelbase bike. They both have the same fork offset and fork length. This also matches the truss fork geometry of the Jones 29. I'll show you that. Here is Jones 29-inch wheel bike with a titanium truss fork. This has the same offset or rake and same fork length and a long steer tube. So all this ends up being a perfect fit. So if you have a truss fork and you're thinking about looking for other options such as a Unicrown fork, which is nice for travel because it's easier to remove for packing your bike. You can spin the wheel around backwards, which the truss fork you can't do that. This is a pretty nice option. Okay, Jones long wheelbase plus frame. This doesn't have the LWB on it here because this frame was made before the name change, but now it's known as the LWB or long wheelbase because it has a long wheelbase and it uses 29 by 2.4 tires up to 29 by 3.25. You can go smaller than those sizes, but there's no point. So here's the frame set. Frame and fork with the new Unicrown fork. So here's the new Unicrown fork, and the difference is 150 spacing, so you can use a standard 150 hub. This builds even a stronger front wheel than my old 135 hubs. Full through axle design. These dropouts are my design, and they have a little chamfer here and here to help guide the wheel in, so it's easier to swap the wheel out. Bosses front and rear, a disc tab that goes from the dropout all the way up the leg so that the torque of the disc brake, trying to push its way into the fork is spread out and pulled along all this so it's nice and stiff. This steerer tube, just like my older steerer tubes, there's the older version and the newer one together. Older one and newer, the dropouts are a big difference, the bosses, but they both have a taper, a little taper on the steer tube. It doesn't mean it uses an oversized headset. It uses a standard 1 1/8, which used to be known as oversized, I guess, so I shouldn't say that. The steer tube is butted on the inside and has a taper on the outside. This is machined on the outside, but it's a kind of a butting process on the inside, so it's thicker down at the bottom, but thinner right where it needs to be because this is the highest stress part of the fork. So we have stiff, strong, light fork. If you look down the center of this, you can see that it's thinner right through here. Very nice welds, big tubes that are ovalized now to make them a little stiffer front to rear. I used to have them round, now they're oval. These bosses are great for running the lowrider racks or running a single bottle up here or a single bottle down there. I like them down a little lower center of gravity. Keeps it out of the way of my knees a little more, but up here is easier to reach. Or you can use a bigger cage and run it like that. At first, the fork is only going to be available with the frame as a complete bike. We have very few of these right now, so we're taking orders now for bikes built like this. Diamond frames, either a titanium frame or a steel frame with either the Truss or the Unicrown fork. Some of the differences in how this fork rides. This fork is a little more flexible front to rear than the Truss fork. The Truss fork is very stiff front to rear, so when you're using the brakes very aggressively, and even if you're doing a kind of a stoppy up onto the front wheel, you won't feel a lot of flutter. This fork, being a Unicrown fork or a cantilevered fork, is going to have a little bit more front to rear flex, like this. Any fork will do that you rock a little bit, and this can add comfort because as you go down the trail, it's absorbing the bumps a little bit. But then when you pull the brakes really hard, you might get a little shudder or a little stuttering, but this is still a very stiff Unicrown fork. It's not suspension corrected, so it's very short from the axle to the crown, so we don't have a long lever, so it's not as flexible. But because it does rake out a lot on this model, the LWB Plus, and it has a slacker head angle, this allows this fork to really flex a lot and absorb bumps. So when you're rolling down the road, especially when your front brake isn't on, this fork has a very comfortable ride compared to the Truss. It's actually more comfortable than the Truss a lot of the time, but then the Truss fork has a kind of more precise feel because it doesn't move as much. So a little smoother, different feel. Here's the long wheelbase fork. This has more fork offset and it's longer than on the short wheelbase, so it would be made for this frame. And I want to show you how the hub fits. I have a little chamfer right there, a bevel, so that when you're sliding the wheel in place, it will help guide you right in. So it's very easy install. Just kind of showing you the reason of the design. Slide this in place. Axle goes through. It's pretty easy to use a through axle. Then you make it tight. And now this thing is just solid in there, secure, very precise steering, and it won't fall out. And it's more durable than a normal quick release. So nice change on bikes. And with the wide flange spacing of the 150 hub, it's even wider than boost front hubs. Boost front hubs are the 110 spacing. This is much wider and equally spaced from the center, so you get a stronger, stiffer front wheel that's less likely to bend and not as flimsy side to side, which, believe it or not, normal wheels are pretty flexy side to side. When you switch out to something like this, it makes a big difference. Back with the Unicrown instead of the Truss. This is our most popular tire right now, the Maxxis Chronicle 29x3. Very good clearance with a 3-inch tire. This is my Jones C rim, which is 56 millimeters wide. It's a very wide rim, very tough. This is a V tire bulldozer, 3.25 inch, set up for tubeless. This also fits very nicely in the fork. So there's your clearance for a 3.25 on a 56 millimeter rim. It's nice to have room for mud, pine cones, sticks, or anything else to go through instead of wedging in there and stopping your front wheel. For very muddy situations where you want a lot of mud clearance, or if you want to have lighter wheels for better sprint or better acceleration or whatever reason, or if you want to run some road tires like some Schwalbe G1 Speeds or Big Apples or some kind of touring like a 29x2.3 slick or a road tire. Here's how the fork looks with a 29x2.6 on a 50 millimeter rim. Fits a lot of tires. If you're getting a Jones bike and you want to use it for off-road and road, which I have a lot of people who call and will ask about this and say, can I use it for a tour, road tour? Use it for off-roading? Yes. Works really well for both these things. But you don't need to buy a second wheel set, just a second set of tires maybe. Really, a set of tires like this will work great for a lot of road touring and be very efficient and have a good ride, or you can go to, again, a 29x2.3 for the road. So, but with the same wide rims, the 2.3s will work great on these rims and actually be more stable, and you can run a lower pressure than if you were to have them on a skinnier rim, which is normally done. So on the short wheelbase Jones, which is almost the same, or very similar to the Jones 29, which has been around for a long time, or known as the original Jones frame or standard or something, when it was a single-size 23-inch. This is the fork that you would put on that. So if you have one of those frames, you could use this fork. So the tire clearance for this road tire, which is a Speedster 27.5 by 3 inch, big wide tire. You'll float across gravel, very good traction on the street. It'll slide a little bit in some loose stuff, but it's a very nice tire. And as far as getting caught on little ledges or potholes or driveways or something like this, with such a low pressure at around 13 to 15 psi in these tires, it has excellent traction. It's very forgiving. It's very easy to ride with these wheels. Show you how the tires fit on the short wheelbase fork. So again, 27.5 by 3, again down to a 29 inch. So we know 29 inch worked on the long wheelbase, and it also works on the short wheelbase fork with a lot of clearance. So again, for mud clearance or for running a road tire, short wheelbase fork. Now, one option you have with the short wheelbase frame set as a wheel option that has been around for a while on my bikes is running a fat front wheel. Before I rode 29 plus wheels, I rode my bike with a fat front wheel most of the time, because the fat wheel, it's not just for snow, it just has a lot of traction. It's very forgiving, won't get caught in ruts, and it's very easy on your hands. So if you have a short wheelbase bike and you add a 27.5 by 3.8, then you'll end up with a tall enough wheel to match either a 29 or a 27.5 by 3 in the rear. So you have these big tall wheels with an extra fat one in the front, so that the front end of the bike is easier on your hands, doesn't get caught in the ruts, and keeps you more upright, where the rear wheel can just trail behind the front wheel. So a nice option for the short wheelbase bike is this fat wheel. On the long wheelbase bike, this wheel's a little short, and I would rather have a 29 by 3.25 myself, but this will also fit on the long wheelbase bike. And then this is, again, on the short wheelbase fork, which was made for the 27.5 or 29 inch wheel. It will accept a full 3.25 up front. It doesn't have as much clearance as the other fork, but this fits. So if you want to go up to this really big size in the front, you can. You can't have this tire size of the rear on the rear of this bike, but you could run it in the front. So this is an example of a loaded or a more loaded bike. Again, this red bike is the bike that I was trying to introduce to really everyone, who rides bikes, through bike magazines or however I could, to let everyone know that a larger size wheel has lower rolling resistance and will give you a smoother, more comfortable ride. So a touring bike should look something like this. So on my older version, I had to start adding bosses, and we made changes. And now eventually we get to the newer version of this. Because I've had people ask me, they say, Jeff, you don't make a touring bike. I would have gotten a bike from you, but you don't make a touring bike. So I bought a touring bike and I'm putting your handlebars on it. But what a lot of people are doing is we're all buying these skinny tired bikes that are called touring bikes. But something like this I like as a touring bike. Lower rolling resistance, smoother ride, better for carrying a load, easier to control, less likely to crash. You're going to fatigue less. Everything's great except for the sprinting isn't as hot with heavier wheels. But so the new version, this is the new version of the short wheelbase frame with the short wheelbase Unicrown fork. This bike has 55 millimeters of offset. The long wheelbase has 76, which is around 3 inches, or about 3 inches. And this bike takes 29 by 2.3 tires as well, just like the other bike. But the fat size it takes is 27.5 by 3. So it's just a smaller wheeled bike when you're using a fat tire, and a shorter wheelbase bike. So it's pretty nice for the road and for touring. Still good for technical off-road. But this is a very nice gravel road touring all-arounder bike. And as you can see, since I'm talking about the fork, that you can run the lowrider racks up here, very solid, with a bottle above it. You have another cage on this side. So there's a lot of ways you can load this thing up. You could also put full fenders on here, and even a front rack, which I really don't recommend, because anytime I've tried putting a load up here, the way the weight swings back and forth affects the handling in kind of a bad way. But if needed for a delivery bike or something, it would make sense. So, touring, city gravel bike, whatever. 2 different forks, long wheelbase fork, short wheelbase fork. The long wheelbase fork is longer from axle to crown, and it has more rake to it. Short wheelbase fork is a little shorter and has less rake, but still more rake or offset than a conventional mountain bike fork. The new Jones Unicrown fork will be available very soon with a frame, as a frame set, so you can get the frame and fork together, or you can just get the fork by itself for your Jones bike. Since it's a rigid specific fork built for the geometry of a Jones bike, it won't work on many other bikes unless they're built with the same geometry or very similar geometry.